My name's Jack, and I've lived in Maplewood Heights my whole life. It's one of those neighborhoods where everyone knows everyone. The lawns are always trimmed, the mailboxes freshly painted, and the worst crime we ever see is a teenager spray painting a stop sign. Or so I thought. It started 2 weeks ago when Mrs. Henderson from across the street vanished. She was a widow in her 60s, always tending to her rose garden or chatting with the neighbors during her morning walks. One day she was there, and the next, her house sat dark and quiet. At first, everyone assumed she'd gone to visit family, but days turned into a week, and her car hadn't moved from the driveway. That's when the whispers began. I couldn't let it go. Mrs. Henderson had been kind to me growing up, always offering cookies or letting me play with her golden retriever, Buddy. Something about her sudden disappearance didn't sit right with me. One evening, I decided to check her house. I didn't plan on snooping, just walking by to see if anything seemed out of place. But when I got closer, I noticed her back gate was open, swinging slightly in the breeze. That wasn't like her. She was meticulous about keeping everything locked up. Against my better judgment, I stepped into her backyard. Buddy's doghouse was empty, his leash still hanging on the wall. The garden she loved so much looked abandoned, weeds creeping in. And then I saw it. A single muddy footprint near the back door. The next day, I mentioned the footprint to my neighbor, Tom. He's a retired cop, the kind of guy who notices everything. Doesn't seem right, he muttered, rubbing his chin. Maybe I'll take a look. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I sat by my window, staring at Mrs. Henderson's dark house. That's when I saw a shadow moving past her living room window. My stomach tightened. Someone was in there. I grabbed my phone and called Tom. Within minutes, he was at my door with a flashlight and a determined look. "Stay here," he said, but I followed him anyway. We approached the house cautiously, the beams of our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The front door was locked, but Tom found an open window around the side. He hoisted himself in, and I reluctantly followed. The air inside was heavy, like the house had been closed up for weeks. The living room was just as I remembered it, neat, cozy, untouched. But the feeling of being watched was undeniable. As we searched the house, it became clear something was wrong. The refrigerator was still stocked with food, a coffee mug sat on the counter, and Mrs. Henderson's knitting lay half-finished on the couch. It was as if she'd just stepped out and never come back. But in the basement, we found something that sent a chill down my spine. A small table sat in the corner, covered with papers and photographs. Most of them were of the neighborhood houses, cars, people going about their day. At the center of the table was a map of Maplewood Heights with certain houses circled in red ink. My house was one of them. Tom's expression darkened. "This isn't random," he said, picking up one of the photos. It was of me, taken from a distance while I was mowing my lawn. We didn't hear the door creak open behind us until it was too late. I spun around, my heart pounding, and saw the figure standing in the doorway. It was a man, dressed in dark clothes, his face partially hidden by a baseball cap. Tom stepped forward, his flashlight shining directly into the intruder's eyes. "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" Tom's voice was steady, but I could sense the tension behind it. The man didn't answer. Instead, he bolted up the basement stairs, his footsteps echoing in the small space. Tom reacted immediately, chasing after him, yelling, "Call the cops, Jack." I fumbled with my phone, my hand shaking as I dialed 911. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, Tom was outside, shouting into the darkness as the man disappeared into the night. The dispatcher told me officers were on their way. I hung up, my pulse racing, and joined Tom outside. "Did you see his face?" I asked. Tom shook his head. "No, but he left in a hurry." That means he didn't want to be caught. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights illuminating the quiet street. Two officers entered Mrs. Henderson's house, while another asked us questions on the lawn. I told them about the shadow I'd seen, the map in the basement, and the man who had fled. Tom filled in the rest, adding his suspicions about the open gate and the muddy footprint. The officers came back out after what felt like an eternity. "The basement is strange," one of them said. "We'll need to process everything." "Do you know if Mrs. Henderson had any enemies?" "Enemies?" I echoed. "No, she was one of the nicest people I knew." The officer nodded but didn't look convinced. "We'll be in touch." As they packed up and left, Tom turned to me. "Something's not adding up. That guy wasn't just trespassing, he was after something." The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about the map. Why were certain houses circled? Why mine? Tom and I decided to take a closer look at the other houses marked on the map. We started with the one directly across the street. It belonged to the Parkers, a quiet couple who mostly kept to themselves. Tom knocked on their door, and Mr. Parker answered, looking surprised to see us. When we asked if anything unusual had happened recently, his expression shifted. "Actually, yes," he said. "A few nights ago, I thought I heard someone in the backyard. When I went to check, the gate was open, but no one was there. I figured it was just the wind." Tom exchanged a glance with me. "Did you report it?" Mr. Parker shook his head. "I didn't think it was worth bothering the police over." We continued visiting the circled houses, hearing similar stories, strange noises, open gates, things moved out of place. But the last house on the list sent a chill through me. It belonged to Mr. Reed, an older man who lived alone. When we knocked, there was no answer. His car was in the driveway, and his mailbox was overflowing with letters. Tom frowned and walked around the house, peering through the windows. "Something's not right," he muttered. When he returned to the front, he said, "We need to call the cops again." An officer arrived and broke the lock on the door. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, just like Mrs. Henderson's, and just like her, Mr. Reed was nowhere to be found. That evening, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my living room, staring at the dark street outside, when my phone buzzed. It was Tom. "You need to come over," he said, his voice urgent. "Now." I hurried to his house, where he had laid out copies of old newspaper articles on his kitchen table. "I started digging into Mrs. Henderson's background," he explained. "Turns out, she wasn't always a widow from Maplewood Heights. 30 years ago, she testified in a high-profile trial against a powerful crime syndicate." I blinked. "Are you saying her disappearance is connected to that?" Tom nodded. "And it gets worse. Mr. Reed was a retired federal agent. He worked on the same case." A chill ran down my spine. "So you think they're being targeted?" Tom leaned back, his expression grim. "I think they're tying up loose ends." If Tom was right, that meant someone in our quiet little neighborhood was hunting people connected to this decades-old case. The circled houses weren't random, they were targets, but why was my house circled? I'd never been involved in anything remotely close to this. That's when it hit me. Mrs. Henderson had always been protective of me growing up. What if she had been trying to shield me from something? Tom's voice broke through my thoughts. We need to figure out who that man was last night, and we need to do it fast. As Tom and I pieced together the puzzle, a knock on his door startled us. It was Officer Ramirez, one of the cops who had responded to the initial call. "I've been digging into the case," Ramirez said, stepping inside. "There's something you need to see." He laid down a file containing Mrs. Henderson's testimony from the trial Tom had mentioned. It detailed her role as a whistleblower in exposing the crime syndicate's money laundering operation. The file also revealed the name of the lead investigator on the case, Daniel Carter. My blood ran cold. Daniel Carter was my father. I could barely process what Ramirez had just said. My father had died in a car accident when I was 10, or at least that's what I'd been told. "Are you saying my dad's death wasn't an accident?" I asked, my voice shaking. Tom and Ramirez exchanged a look. "It's possible," Tom said carefully. "If he was connected to this case, the syndicate might have targeted him." "And now they're coming after you," Ramirez added. It all made sense. Mrs. Henderson watching over me, the map, the man in her house. She must have known the syndicate would come looking for me eventually. We didn't have much time. Tom, Ramirez, and I devised a plan to lure the man out and get him to reveal who he was working for. Ramirez agreed to set up surveillance on my house while Tom and I prepared to confront him. The key was the map. If the man wanted it as badly as we suspected, we'd use it to bait him. That night, I left a light on in my living room and sat by the window with the map spread out on the table. Tom waited outside, hidden in the shadows, and Ramirez monitored the feed from the patrol car parked down the street. It didn't take long. Around midnight, I heard the sound of glass shattering in the kitchen. My heart raced as I stayed seated, pretending not to notice. Footsteps crept closer, and then the man from the basement appeared in the doorway. "Looking for this," I said, holding up the map. His eyes narrowed. "You shouldn't have gotten involved." Before he could move, Tom burst in from the back door, his flashlight blinding the man. Ramirez followed seconds later, gun drawn. Hands where I can see them. The man froze, but his expression was defiant. "You think this ends with me? You don't know who you're dealing with." The man was arrested, and under pressure from Ramirez and his colleagues, he gave up the names of others involved in the syndicate's operation. It turned out they had been systematically hunting down everyone connected to the trial, erasing any trace of the case. Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Reed had likely been taken to silence them, but their courage had left behind a trail of evidence that finally brought the truth to light. As for me, I learned more about my father than I ever thought I would. He had died protecting people like Mrs. Henderson, and now it was my turn to honor his legacy. Maplewood Heights would never feel quite as safe as it once did, but at least the ghosts of the past had been laid to rest. And as I stood on my porch that evening, watching the sunset over the quiet street, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't afraid anymore.